Colleagues mock poor girl who's pregnant before marriage, unaware that babe's dad is their CEO. She walked into the office with her head held high, despite the whispers that followed her like shadows. Look at her, pregnant and unmarried, they sneered, unaware that the father of her children was watching their every move. What these cruel colleagues didn't know was that their ordinary co-worker, Bo, was actually Bo Jingyi, the powerful CEO of the very company they worked for. As Su Ningying endured their torment day after day, he was silently taking notes, preparing for the moment when justice would finally be served. Su Ning pushed through the revolving doors of her office building, her steps quick but measured. To the untrained eye, she might have seemed calm, maybe even indifferent, but as she walked toward her desk, there was no mistaking the faint stirrings of laughter and the unmistakable hush of lowered voices following her. One glance at the huddled figures near the coffee machine confirmed what she already knew. Josie was holding court again. Josie leaned casually against the counter, her voice pitched just loud enough to be heard across the room. I mean, seriously, can you imagine? Pregnant, with no ring, waddling into work like she owns the place. She must be so used to the pity stares by now. The gathered group chuckled, their stifled laughter making its way to Su Ningning's ears. She paused for the briefest moment, gripping her bag a little tighter before moving forward without a word. Josie wasn't done though. She tossed her perfectly curled hair over her shoulder and added, as though it were an afterthought, "Must be exhausting for her, really. I mean, no husband, no dignity, and probably no future at this company." The words hit harder than Su Ningning allowed herself to show. Her desk felt like an island in the middle of an unforgiving ocean, the whispers and smirks lapping at her from all sides. She sat down, quietly pulling files from her bag, her gaze fixed on the paperwork in front of her, as though it held all the answers she needed. To them, she was little more than a cracked vase, flawed, broken, but none of them could see the light she carried inside her, the quiet strength she leaned on every day, simply to silence her trembling hands. It was no surprise that their cruelty targeted the very thing that made her most vulnerable. As a single mother, she already felt like she was walking a tightrope, balancing the demands of her job with the needs of her children. Josie and her group were eager to exploit this, through uncasing comments or sharp-edged jokes her way whenever the chance arose. The isolation that came with it wasn't accidental. It was intentional. Her colleagues excluded her from team lunches and left her name off harmless after-work party invites. These small, deliberate actions added to the weight she carried daily, making even the simplest office tasks feel monumental. Studies suggest that workplace bullying affects single mothers more deeply than many others. The isolation, the whisperers, the constant strain of unfair judgment, every laugh behind her back, every conversation that fell silent the moment she approached, left another crack. Still, Su Nianyan's expression remained unreadable. She had perfected it over time, that unshakable stoicism, a mask she wore like armor. But her heart said otherwise. Sometimes, it felt as though an invisible scar stretched across her chest, one that ached with every passing comment. No one knew how many nights she sat in her tiny apartment, staring at her reflection and telling herself she was enough, trying to believe the words even as doubt loomed larger with each passing day. And yet, she showed up, every morning, without hesitation and without fail. She walked past Josie's group and sat at that same desk, enduring the unkindness and waiting, silently, for her luck to change. Her resilience was quiet but unyielding, though no one seemed to notice. No one, that is, except for him. Bo Jingyi sat 3 rows away, just close enough to observe, without drawing attention. If anyone bothered to look at him, he seemed like just another co-worker, quiet, polite, and astonishingly ordinary. But his eyes followed the undercurrent of cruel glances and whispers, like a detective pursing a case. Every time Su Ningying weathered another cold remark or ignored a taunt lobbed from across the room, he saw it, and though his expression rarely changed, there was a sharpness in his gaze, a quiet intensity that hinted at thoughts much deeper than the spreadsheets in front of him. That day, as Josie's laughter filled the office and Su Ningying poured herself into her work, Bo acted. While most eyes were on Josie's latest round of petty gossip, he walked over to the break room, picked up a steaming cup of coffee, and placed it on Su Ningming's desk without a word. The gesture was simple, almost imperceptible, But for Su Ningning, who stared at the cup for several seconds longer than she intended, it was like hearing a kind word after days of silence. For the first time that morning, her lips curved slightly upward. It was clear that Bo's kindness wasn't accidental. He understood things that others in the office blissfully overlooked, the toll that whispers take on their intended target. How being excluded, mocked, and judged can leave someone doubting parts of themselves they once held pride in. While Josie spent her time belittling her, and others were complicit in their unchecked silence, Bo Jingyi saw something entirely different in Su Ningning. Resilient. He didn't pity her. He admired her. But the office didn't know. What no one could even begin to suspect was just how much weight Bo's harmless gestures carried. He wasn't just a colleague. He wasn't just an anonymous figure blending into the background. Quiet as he seemed, Yi carried a secret that would turn this room of whispers and judgment on its head. But for now, just for now, he settled for knowing the effect his small act of kindness had already sparked. As Su Ningning softly touched the rim of the coffee cup, her heart felt something unfamiliar, a flicker of warmth against the cold stretch of her daily life. For a moment, at least, the laughter in the background didn't seem so loud, and the weight of whispers didn't press so heavily on her shoulders. She sipped the coffee slowly, and while she didn't turn to look at Bo, a quick glance shared between them told her something she hadn't heard in a long time. You're not alone in this. But who was Bo Jingyi, really? And why did his gaze linger on Su Ningning, like he knew far more than he let on? Bo Jingyi was a man designed to blend in. In the chaotic office drama that swirled around him, most of his co-workers would have described him in the same way. Quiet, polite, maybe even unremarkable. He wasn't the one leading meetings or cracking jokes during team lunches. If anything, he often felt like a shadow, present but unobtrusive, fading into the office background. He had an uncanny ability to remain unnoticed, even in the corners of conversations or casual observation. It was a skill he wore comfortably, one that allowed him to mask the reality underneath. But masking, as effortless as he made it seem, came with a cost. Each morning, he arrived just as the coffee machine sputtered with its first cup. His desk, methodically organized down to the rubber band folded neatly over a stack of miscellaneous papers, was an extension of his personality, or at least the personality he wanted others to see. It was the kind of thing that made you forget someone was even there, blending seamlessly into the hum of co-workers' chatter and daily tasks. And yet, there was an intensity about him most people overlooked. You could see it in the way he listened, watching people's faces as they spoke, catching nuances that even they wouldn't notice in themselves. No expression slipped past him, no change in tone went unheard. He was surveying everything, always processing, always thinking. To most, this made him a reliable presence, an unbothered bystander. But what they couldn't know was how deliberately he cultivated this image, and why. He wasn't just watching out of curiosity. There was a purpose behind every glance, every weighty pause, before he returned his focus to his screen. And more, his attention circled back to Su Ningning. He often caught himself lingering a moment too long on her, his gaze lined with something unspoken. It was never enough to draw her attention, or anyone else's he knew when to draw. But there were moments that went unnoticed by the world around him. Her wringing her hands beneath her desk after Yossi's latest jab, her deliberate, focused stares at her computer when the whispers swelled behind her back. Every glance he stole felt like adding another piece to a puzzle, though the finished image was one he seemed reluctant to assemble just yet. It wasn't just the whispers that unsettled him. It was the weight she carried, the way she absorbed her colleagues' ridicule with a silence that didn't feel like choice but necessity. He saw it in how her shoulders stiffened when she walked by a group, her head held high but her steps just slightly quicker than they needed to be. She reminded him of someone walking through heavy rain without an umbrella, determined to reach her destination but unable to escape the cold. And though the rain was metaphoric, it was real enough to him to leave him sitting at his desk later than usual some evenings, running through ways he could make things easier without revealing too much. What no one knew, not even Su Ningning, was that his concern didn't come out of nowhere. 5 years ago, in a distant country where the streets were unfamiliar and the language on the signs blurred into gibberish, Su Yingying's face had been the only thing that brought him clarity. Though stranded, frustrated, and reckless with youth, she had appeared. What should have been a brief act of kindness had unfolded into something far more. She had extended a hand where no one else did, not knowing she was anchoring him in place, adding a permanence he had carried with him ever since. Back then, he had witnessed a warmth in her that stood in stark contrast to her current circumstances. Now, he watched what the whispers and isolation had done to her. It wasn't just anger, or even guilt, that stirred in him. It was something much harder to put into words. Even with this history, though, Bo Jingyi wasn't merely a man consumed by his past. There was a strategic calculation in every move he made. Unlike the others in the office he hid, the reality he hid wasn't just that he had known Su Ning before. It was that he was no ordinary co-worker. Beneath the layers of routine anonymity, he carried the weight of being the company's CEO, a role few could associate with his quiet demeanor or unruffled presence. It wasn't desire for dramatics, nor arrogance, that kept him in disguise. On the surface, it was strategic, a way of understanding the company from the inside. Yet, on a deeper level, Bo Qingyi knew this disguise served another purpose. Being close to people, truly seeing their unfiltered selves, gave him insight that titles and boardrooms could never offer. Still, maintaining this secrecy wasn't as effortless as he made it appear. Research into the psychological toll of leading a double life emphasizes the deep strain it can place on someone over time. Each interaction became a performance. Every smile, every mundane observation he dropped into conversation had to toe the line between present enough to be relatable, yet restrained enough to not raise questions. Living an undercover identity meant abandoning parts of himself. He couldn't share stories of his travels or offhandedly complain about the late-night meetings he carried in his real role. The constant compartmentalization often felt like walking a tightrope, where even the smallest misstep could set off a chain reaction he couldn't control. And yet, that emotional burden coexisted with his meticulous, controlled decision-making. One day, when Su Ningning found herself tangled in a project many saw as doomed to fail, he made his first silent move. It appeared to everyone else as a typical mid-Cymex reassignment. One team had been switched for another, and the workload spread to even the odds. But from that moment forward, something changed for Su Ningning. There was suddenly less weight on her shoulders, less space for blame to land squarely at her feet. To the rest of the office, it was invisible. They didn't see Bo pulling the strings to reroute tasks, writing the emails late at night in the name of making things more equitable. If anything, his actions blurred further into his ordinary image. That was the goal: precision without exposure. Yet, there were limits to how long he could remain a shadow. His hidden authority periodically unveiled itself in small, controlled bursts, pieces impossible to ignore if you caught them. Shortly after diffusing the problem at Su Ningning's expense, late one night when the office halls were long abandoned and the cleaning crew had started their rounds, Bo entered an office most employees knew as restricted territory. It was quiet, the kind of silence reserved for spaces more used to booming declarations and tense negotiations. But tonight, it was just him, a figure who had shed the meticulous mask he wore 9 to 5, now perfectly at home, behind the CEO's polished oak desk. The city lights winked through the glass windows behind him as he turned on the desk lamp, spreading files across the table, his demeanor sharp and focused in a way most had never seen him. This was the only room where he could take off his disguise. His command of the space spoke to a truth he carefully concealed during daylight hours. From across the silent office floor, a janitor caught sight of the figure as he passed by outside the glass room. To his credit, the janitor only paused briefly, likely dismissing it as a late-night meeting or another executive's assistant wrapping up loose ends. But if he had looked closer through the faint glow of desk light and city haze, perhaps he would have noticed something far more significant than a man revising report. That room, its weight, and what it signified was a throne, and Bo Jingyi was the unassuming king of the company. For now, his mask remained intact when morning came and the coffee brewed again. Nobody noticed him more than they had before. To most, he was still the same quiet, diligent co-worker in the same striped tie or spotless desk chair, watching, listening, calculating. But if you happened to catch him at the right angle, in the way he monitored Su Ningning's improbable resilience, or the precise timings of his carefully organized interventions, it was clear that something larger had been set into motion. The office chaos had always operated on a surface-level pettiness, but now there was a rising tension floating underneath, an unseen fuse waiting to ignite. For Bo Jingyi, each passing day tightened the web of secrecy he so carefully built. There would come a reckoning, a moment when shadow would have to give way to light, where hidden authority would demand clarity. But for now, for everyone else, he was still invisible. For now, the only hint of the truth came in the way his eyes lingered on Su Ningning's figure for just a moment longer than they should. The stage was quietly, methodically, and absolutely irrevocably being set. 5 years ago, in an unfamiliar country where everything seemed overwhelming, Su Ningning waited at a bus terminal. The streets were loud with unfamiliar voices, and signs in a foreign language loomed high above her, their neon glow distorted by light rain. She had been traveling alone, not out of leisure but necessity. Her plans that day had been stretched thin by delays, unhelpful attendants, and the weight. She was no stranger to adapting. She adjusted her scarf and stood still, the faint chill of the weather brushing against her face as she scanned her surroundings for any sign of direction. It was then that she noticed him, a man no older than his late 20s at the time, sitting on a metal bench near the terminal entrance. Unlike the bustling crowd surging on and off buses around them, he remained still. He wore a dark jacket, his hair tousled from the damp breeze of the evening, and his posture betrayed his unease. His phone, nearly out of battery, blinked uselessly in his hand, while a small map lay crumpled on the bench beside him. If Su Ningning hadn't looked twice, he might have seemed like any other traveler stuck in transit. But something about the way his eyes moved told a different story. He wasn't simply stranded, he was overwhelmed. She hesitated for a moment, glancing at her watch. She had her own problems to solve, and wasn't convinced that walking up to a stranger would help her solve any of them. Yet, when she saw the man rub his temple and stand, looking more lost than before, she found herself stepping forward. Without hesitation, she spoke in a language closer to his own, her words calm and measured. "Excuse me, do you need help?" The man turned quickly, startled that anyone had addressed him. For the first time all day, his defensiveness relaxed slightly, though his voice carried an edge of hesitation. I think I missed my stop, and my phone's useless right now." His accent was clipped and sharp, definitely not local to Su Ningying. He looked like someone who hated being in a position to ask for help. She recognized that tight look in his face, the frustration of someone used to control, but struggling in a situation they couldn't dictate. For a moment, she thought he might resist her offer to assist. But then his shoulders dropped ever so slightly, as he admitted, "I don't even know which way to go." Her only answer was a nod. Extending her hand, she motioned for him to pull out the address he was trying to reach. She studied it in silence for a brief moment before making a decisive gesture. "It's on the other side of the city." She glanced back down at her watch. "But there's a bus heading the right way soon. Come with me." It wasn't a grand gesture. There weren't declarations of heroism or acts of dramatic sacrifice. But to Bo Jingyi, who had been fighting the rising panic of being stranded in a country where no one understood his language, it was a moment that he would replay in his head long after it had passed. She was calm, unshaken by his initial awkwardness. She didn't ask him unnecessary questions or linger on what had gone wrong, as though she understood intuitively what he needed most: someone to steady the chaos, even if just for an hour. There was no fanfare, no expectation. She offered him what little help she could, directions, translation, and the assurance of a person who seemed to know exactly where she was headed. To him, she felt like a guiding light, cutting through a dark, confusing night. The memory of the journey stood out not in its complexity, but in its simplicity. She kept the conversation easy, asking little of him beyond what was necessary to figure out the logistics. They walked through narrow streets toward the next terminal, bypassing bustling market vendors and stray scooters weaving through traffic. The rest of the evening blurred together as she led him across the city's unfamiliar corners. Twice, she negotiated with transport attendants for a quicker transfer route, her voice steadier than it had any right to be given the late hour and their shared exhaustion. When at last he reached his destination, a nondescript apartment building tucked into a quiet neighborhood, she didn't linger. She offered a polite smile, a soft good luck, and turned back the way they had come. Before he could thank her properly, the moment was over. To him, she was the light in a foreign land, the memory told him now. Bo Jianyi would reflect on the encounter later, especially during quiet periods in his life. When reflection snuck up on him uninvited, he would remember her unassuming nature, the way she silently offered kindness without obligation. And though she didn't wait for gratitude or acknowledgement, the experience left an indelible mark on him. In moments of crisis, the human mind often clings to strangers who extend kindness unexpectedly. Gratitude, this feeling of appreciation for someone's selflessness, has an enduring quality, one far deeper than polite courtesies. Psychologically speaking, gratitude strengthens our emotional ties, working as a powerful component of reciprocity. Being cared for sparks a need to reciprocate, to ensure the other person feels valued as well. What Su Ningning didn't know was how deeply that one brief moment of her life would ripple across both their futures. To this day, Bo Jingyi remembers watching her walk away, her figure swallowed by the market crowd. In her absence, his distress had been replaced with an emotion harder to process. He hated the idea that she left without anything in return. There had been no way to repay her, no time to pause and measure the full impact of her actions. What lingered wasn't just the memory of her guidance, but the feeling that he owed her something greater than gratitude. Years passed, and their lives carried them in vastly different directions. For Su Ningyi, that evening became one of countless others she filed into the back of her mind. A time she had stepped in because it was the right thing to do, not because she expected any personal gain. For Bo Jingyi, however, her act became an anchor. It was more than just a memory. It became part of his moral fabric, a thread weaving itself into his thoughts, driving his choices in ways he could never have anticipated. When he caught sight of her again for the first time in years, it wasn't at an airport or on some bustling street that mirrored their past encounter. It was in the very building he had carefully crafted as part of his professional ambition. An office setting filled with people whose concerns ranged from deadlines to lunch orders. And there, amidst it all, was her face. At first, he could hardly reconcile the image in his mind from years ago with the woman standing before him now, weighed down, yet still carrying that quiet resilience he remembered so vividly from their first meeting. She seemed different now, not broken, but tired. As he continued to observe her day after day, the scattered details of her current life filled in the blanks. He learned through indirect comments and overheard conversations that life had not been kind to her. The whispers of her colleagues made it clear that she bore a heavy burden, and that the isolation she endured wasn't just professional, but deeply personal. To him, she wasn't just a co-worker navigating workplace politics. She was the same person who had extended her hand when he needed it most. And if gratitude builds a need for reciprocity, Bo Jingyi's growing protectiveness was now rooted in something undeniable. In the present, Bo Jingyi often found himself slipping moments from their shared past into quieter, more reflective corners of his mind. That urge to return her kindness, to repay the unspoken debt he had carried since that foreign evening, wasn't just an obligation anymore. It had grown into something much deeper, an unacknowledged bond that stretched far beyond that single act of kindness. The memory of her didn't just remind him of how he had been saved, it reminded him of the person she truly was, beyond the whispers and the scorn she now faced. But their shared history was only part of the story. Secrets still lingered in the shadows, and what Su Ningning didn't know was how the quiet man, who now exchanged polite nods across the office, was slowly positioning himself to ensure her storms wouldn't drown her again. The day began like any other, a stale chill in the air of the office, fluorescent lights flickering faintly above the rows of desks, and the lingering hum of casual workplace chatter. But for Su Ningning, something felt off almost immediately. As she walked to her workstation, a strange hush fell over the employees she passed. Unlike the usual whispers or snickers she was used to hearing, this silence was sharp, deliberate, as though her very presence demanded a sudden shift in energy. When she caught the nervous glance exchanged between two colleagues near the copier, she knew instinctively that this was more than their usual cruelty. Something was wrong. It didn't take long for her unease to solidify into dread. Manager Zhao stormed into the design department barely an hour into the day, his face twisted in frustration. A few key department leads trailed behind him, their eyes filled with judgment, though their lips remained tightly pursed. He clutched a stack of papers tightly in one hand, waving it in the air like evidence in a court trial, as he called the room to attention. "Everyone, listen up," he bellowed. "There's been a serious breach of company data. A set of blueprints from one of our most sensitive projects has been leaked." His voice was sharp, echoing off the walls, and cutting through the usual din of clicking keyboards and murmurs of conversation. For a split second, no one moved. Then came the looks, dozens of eyes, shifting in unspoken accusation, all settling on one person. There was no hesitation. No need for clarification. Su Ningning suddenly felt the weight of the room's collective gaze pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. The murmurs started up again, louder this time, and though she couldn't quite catch every word, the tone of them was unmistakable. Suspicion, disdain, condemnation. Manager Zhao's gaze locked onto hers as he stepped forward. "Su Ningning," he said, drawing her name out like it had some bitter taste he wanted to spit out. "Care to explain how these files ended up with one of our competitors?" He slapped the stack of papers onto her desk with an almost theatrical finality. The pages contained printouts of emails and time-stamped downloads, all leading back to her workstation ID. The timestamps and security logs are pretty clear. Everything traces back to you. Her breath caught in her throat. She blinked down at the papers in front of her, her mind racing to make sense of what she was seeing. Leaking blueprints to a competitor? The accusation was so outrageous, so far removed from any realm of possibility she inhabited, that it almost felt absurd. Except it wasn't, because there it was, all laid out in stark, unforgiving detail. The logs, timestamps, and email headers painted a damning picture, one she had no way to counter, like a web tightening around its prey. The accusations left her with little room to escape. Josie, ever eager to stir chaos, was the first to speak up. "I knew there was something off about her," she said, her voice dripping with smug satisfaction, always keeping to herself. "It makes sense now, doesn't it? She's been hiding something this whole time. Who knows what else she's done behind our backs?" Her words were met with murmurs of agreement from others, most of whom were all too eager to join the growing mob. The room buzzed, with conclusions reached too quickly, assumptions drawn too eagerly. "Seriously, did you think no one would notice?" Another voice chimed in, barely attempting to mask the disgust behind their words. "You're lucky we don't call security on you right now," someone scoffed near the back of the room. "I mean, come on. Pregnant and out of wedlock wasn't enough scandal for her, huh?" The quip drew a ripple of laughter, cruel and cutting, from a few of her co-workers. Her lips parted to respond, but no words came. What could she possibly say in the face of such a tidal wave of blame? The evidence was all fabricated. She knew that much, but convincing anyone here of that truth felt impossible. She glanced at Josie, whose smirk conveyed exactly what she was thinking. "You've already lost." What none of them yet realized, what Su Ying couldn't have known, was that the entire scene was orchestrated. This wasn't an accident, nor was it the result of some coincidence or careless misunderstanding. Zhou Cixi and Bo Jinglin, two employees with a long history of petty grievances and questionable loyalties, had spent weeks plotting this betrayal. By planting the altered security logs and ensuring they could trace back to her computer's IP, they had set the perfect trap, and as the chaos unfolded before them, their satisfaction was palpable, even if concealed beneath carefully neutral expressions. In environments like this, acts of sabotage often spiral quickly, devastating not only reputations, but the fundamental trust between colleagues. Studies reveal that false accusations can create a ripple effect in professional settings, where trust erodes almost instantly, leaving the accused alienated and vulnerable. For Su Ying, this alienation wasn't new. Her colleagues had long excluded and derided her, but this time, it wasn't just condescending whispers or sneers. It was active hostility. Where before there had been quiet judgment, there was now open disdain, and the accusations fed into the narrative many of them already believed about her: that she didn't belong, that she wasn't trustworthy, that she was somehow lesser than them. The emotional toll was immediate and suffocating. As the accusations continued to pile up, each word chipped away at her already fragile defenses. Her colleagues demanded answers she didn't have, their voices rising in an almost frenzied pitch as they called for her termination, some even suggesting they inform law enforcement. Behind her stoic expression, her mind raced. How had it come to this? With every word spoken against her, it felt as though the foundation of her entire career was being ripped out from under her feet. Through it all, there was one figure who didn't join the chorus of condemnation: Bo Qingyi. Seated silently at his usual desk, he watched the events unfold with an intensity he didn't bother to hide. His brow furrowed slightly as he observed each piece of fabricated evidence Manager Qiao presented, his hand resting on his chin, in thought. To the rest of the room, his silence looked like nothing more than the quiet curiosity of an uninvolved bystander. But beneath the surface, his mind worked quickly, connecting dots and analyzing details. He didn't need the full picture to know what this was. Quietly, he began laying the groundwork to intervene. It wasn't dramatic or overt, just subtle actions hidden in the mundane bustle of the office. Late that evening, with the design department empty and silent, Bo logged into the company's internal systems, digging into the security logs. He cross-referenced timestamps and network data, meticulously piecing together discrepancies. The malicious uploads had come from Su Ningning Station, yes, but he quickly identified the remote connections that indicated external interference. The evidence, buried under layers of false metadata, exposed something critical. Su Ningning's computer had been accessed without her knowledge. The culprits hadn't been as careful as they thought. Days passed, and suspicion around Su Ningning only grew. Each time she walked into the break room or passed by a group of colleagues, the tension was almost unbearable. Even as she tried to keep her head down, the weight of fighting a battle she didn't know how to navigate bore down on her harder with each passing hour. Yet, amidst the despair, something unexpected landed in her inbox: an email from an anonymous source. Attached to the message was a folder containing files, screenshots, logs, and evidence that outlined the truth. The real culprits, their methods, even a breakdown of how they had orchestrated the entire incident. It was all laid bare. The pieces fell into place as she read through it. Zhou Cixi's petty grudge over being passed up for a promotion, Jinglin's long-standing jealousy of her efficient work. The anonymous sender was thorough, leaving no room for error or interpretation. It wasn't hard to guess who might have gone to such lengths to protect her, but she was wise enough not to voice her suspicions. She needed to act, and fast. The very next morning, during a department-wide meeting, Su Ningning stood to address the accusations. With careful composure, she presented the evidence, walking through each point with clarity and confidence. The room, which had previously hummed with veiled hostility toward her, now fell silent as the truth became undeniable. By the time she finished, most of her colleagues could barely meet her eyes, their earlier glee at her misfortune now replaced with shame. Even manager Xiao, who had been so quick to cast blame, looked thoroughly chastened. As Zhou Cixi and Bo Jinglin were exposed, the room's atmosphere shifted again. Those who had joined the mob against Su Ningning now scrambled to distance themselves from the real culprits, throwing awkward apologies her way that she returned with nothing more than a polite nod. She didn't need their words of regret. Her innocence had been proven, and that was justice enough. Meanwhile, Bo sat quietly in the corner of the room, as unobtrusive as ever. He didn't react to the events unfolding before him, his expression as neutral as it always was. But when Su Ningning caught his gaze after the meeting, something unspoken passed between them, a flicker of acknowledgement, of gratitude. What the rest of the room failed to realize was how close they had come to losing one of their most talented employees, all because of petty insecurities and unchecked assumptions. For Su Ningyi, there was a sense of vindication, a small but significant victory against the forces that had tried to break her. But even as the dust began to settle, one thing was certain. The end of this battle didn't mean her war was over. The meeting room buzzed with the usual pre-meeting chatter, but today, an air of tension seemed to coat every table. Papers shuffled, phones were discreetly silenced, and the employees of Bo Corporation prepared for what was described in the calendar invite as a critical company announcement. Although no other details were provided, the words alone were enough to ignite speculation. Theories ranged from drastic restructuring to the introduction of new partnerships, but no one in the room could have predicted what was about to unfold. Su Ningning sat in the back corner of the room, her presence barely noticed among the flurry. For her, stepping into meetings like this always came with a deep sense of unease, a feeling only amplified by the recent sabotage and her colleagues' cruelty. Though she had emerged from the ordeal with her name cleared, the damage to her standing in the office lingered. The whispered comments, the lingering stares, the awkward silences in her wake, all served as reminders of the hostility she lived with daily. Today was no different. As employees trickled in, their seats filling rapidly, the occasional side glance, followed by a murmured exchange, confirmed that she was still the topic of conversation. At exactly 9 a.m., the double doors at the front of the room opened. A man walked in, his posture commanding yet relaxed, with an air of confidence that seemed to freeze the room in motion. It was Bo Jingyi. To the untrained eye, there was nothing particularly unusual about him. He appeared as he always did, composed, understated in his attire, blending into the environment without demanding attention. But something about his demeanor today felt heavier, more deliberate. When he stopped at the head of the table and turned to face the room, silence fell almost immediately, a stark contrast to the buzzing atmosphere mere seconds ago. He didn't rush. Bo Jingyi let the pause settle, his gaze sweeping slowly across the room, lingering just long enough on specific faces to make the recipients noticeably uneasy. He flipped open a sleek binder on the table in front of him, but didn't glance at the contents. Instead, his voice broke the silence, calm yet firm. "Good morning," he said, his tone level and deliberate. "Before we begin, let me start by thanking all of you for your contributions to this company. I've spent the last 2 years observing the people in this room, understanding how we work, not just as professionals, but as individuals." His words were disarming but laced with an ambiguity that left the employees sitting up straighter in their chairs. Josie, seated near the center of the room, adjusted her blouse self-consciously, her perfected, smug expression faltering as Bo's eyes briefly met hers. Beside her, Zhou Cixi shifted uncomfortably, busying himself with aligning the pens in front of him. "But what I've learned," Bo continued, his voice sharpening slightly, "is that sometimes what you see on the surface isn't the full story. There are truths hidden beneath appearances, things that, when they're revealed, can change everything you thought you understood. There it was. The tension shifted palpably, like a wire drawn taut, and the room held its collective breath. Dramatic irony worked its magic in full force. The audience, privy to the truth of Beau's identity, could sense the weight of the moment to come. But for the colleagues gathered in that room, ignorant of what boiled beneath the surface, there was only quiet confusion brewing into unease. Su Ningning, seated in her usual quiet corner, frowned faintly, her chest tightening as her gaze flitted between her coworkers and the men at the front of the room. Something about the tone of his words sent ripples through her carefully maintained calm, though she couldn't quite pinpoint why. Her fingers tapped nervously against her notebook, the rhythmic motion betraying her growing anxiety. Bo Jingyi straightened slightly, his next sentence carrying a weight that shifted the atmosphere in the room entirely. For those of you who are unclear about my role here, allow me to clarify. My name is Bo Jingyi, and as of today, it's time you know who I am. He paused, not for dramatic effect, but to simply let the words sink in. The title he was about to reveal entered the room without him needing to say it outright. Yet he did. I am the CEO of Bo Corporation. The words settled over the room like a thunderclap, shattering the silence and shaking the foundation of every casual assumption made in that office. Shock registered first. Wide eyes, parted lips, frozen stare. Josie's perfectly applied lipstick did nothing to hide the panic now dawning on her face, as her brain worked to connect the man she had assumed to be insignificant to the authority now standing in front of her. Joe Cece's pen slipped from his hand, clattering noisily onto the table. But he didn't seem to notice, too busy trying to mask the growing flush creeping up his neck. The room, once filled with whispers, now buzzed with the silence of unspoken regret. For months, they had mocked the quiet, unassuming man they thought of as nothing more than a mediocre coworker. Now, they realized how deeply they had miscalculated, and not just about him, but about Su Ningning. She sat frozen in her seat, her body still, though inside it felt as though 100 emotions were colliding at once. As Bo Jingyi continued to speak, his calm voice overrode the chaos in their minds. I've spent the past 2 years gathering insight into how this company operates on every level. Some things have impressed me. Others, his words cut sharply now, his gaze narrowing in Joe Saki's direction, have shown me where we need improvement. Workplace culture is one of them. His words struck hard, each syllable landing with the precision of someone pulling apart the room's facade. The weight of his observation left no one unaffected, least of all Josie, whose back stiffened under his lingering stare. Bo Corporation, he said, pausing for effect as his eyes swept the room, has zero tolerance for workplace bullying. He didn't raise his voice, but the message was clear. It wasn't a warning. It was a statement of fact. A line etched into the foundation of a company that could no longer afford to let prejudice and cruelty fester within its walls. And as far as Su Ningning's tormentors went, those words were as damning as a sentence handed down in court. As the shame among her colleagues grew, the apologies started meek, stuttering, and almost laughably insincere. They turned to Su Ningning with hurried words, their eyes darting nervously back to Bo Jingyi for approval they knew would never come. Even Josie, who had cemented herself as the figurehead of office ridicule, mumbled something that vaguely resembled an apology, though her gaze never quite reached Su Ning. Unsurprisingly, but it wasn't the apologies that gave Su Ningning her sense of justice. It was Bo's unmistakable stance. When he spoke about her, dropping any pretense of anonymity, it felt like sunlight finally breaking through a storm. There is talent in this company that goes unrecognized because of bias and recklessness, Bo said, his tone unwavering. But let me make one thing abundantly clear. Su Ningning is not undeserving of the position she holds. If anything, she has shown more resilience, dedication, and integrity than most people in this room will ever display. His words sparked something in her she hadn't felt in a long time, a warmth that moved past her defenses and settled in the parts of her that had grown cold with doubt. After enduring months of whispers, judgment, and exclusion. It wasn't power or pity he offered her. It was validation. The meeting adjourned soon after, but the aftermath lingered like the echoes of a bell. As her colleagues filed out of the room, their heads bowed with embarrassment, Su Ying remained seated for a moment. She watched as Bo Jingyi stood near the doorway, quiet and unobtrusive once again. For a moment, he looked every bit the man they had come to misjudge. Modest, reserved, unassuming. But when his eyes met hers, the tiniest flicker of something passed between them. Reassurance. A silent promise that she wasn't alone. That meeting left a dent in the armor of Bo Corporation, one that would take time to repair. But for Su Ying, it marked a turning point. The people who scorned her no longer held the same power. The whispers had faded, and in their place, she felt a strength she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge in years. But while the workplace was now a safer space, their personal lives were about to face another storm. The truth had been revealed, but their challenges were far from over. The truth is a double-edged sword. It cuts through lies, but leaves scars of its own. This thought weighed heavily on Su Ying's mind as she stood in the middle of Madame Bo's living room, her hands clasped tightly together in a failed attempt to stop their trembling. Surrounding her was a room drenched in tradition, from the imposing family portrait that loomed above the mantel to the intricately carved furniture that seemed to groan with the weight of history. This was not a house. It was a monument to a legacy, clearly guarded with pride. And now, that legacy was being questioned. Across from her, Madame Bo sat ramrod straight, her critical gaze fixed on Su Ying with an unrelenting sharpness. At her side, some of the more distant family members, they seemed to multiply by the second, muttered to one another in low tones. Their words weren't meant to reach her ears, but they did. "We still don't even know if the children are really Jingying," one said. "If she's lying, the damage to her reputation will be irreversible," another added, her voice dripping with disdain. In the center of it all was Bo Jingyi. He stood silently beside Su Ying, his expression calm but unreadable. To everyone else, he must have seemed perfectly at ease, as though the prospect of paternity testing and invasive accusations rolled off him like water. But she knew him better now. The faint tightness in his jaw betrayed his restraint, the way his fingers flexed and then curled into his palm when anyone dared question her character. He was holding himself back, not for lack of conviction, but for her sake. If this was her trial, she needed to walk through it on her own terms. Finally, Madame Bo broke the silence. "If you're so certain," she said coolly, her words drawn out with clinical precision, "then neither of you should have any issue with taking a paternity test." It wasn't a question. Her tone left no room for objection, no possibility for debate. The old woman clasped her hands in her lap, lifting her chin ever so slightly as she waited for a response. Su Ying inhaled sharply, but nodded without hesitation. "Of course," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging within her. "We have nothing to hide." The room fell silent again, her words hanging tensely in the air. To some, her answer might have sounded defiant, but to Su Ying, it was far simpler. This test wasn't about proving anything to the Bo family. Even in that moment, standing at the center of the family's scrutiny, her thoughts didn't linger on herself. They drifted instead to the small hands that tugged at her shirt in the early mornings, and the bright smiles that shined even on her darkest days. Her children were innocent in all this, undeserving of the ugliness now pressing in on her from all sides. The process itself was clinical. The sterile smell of the testing clinic clung to the air, mixing with the faint buzz of fluorescent lighting. Su Ying sat with her fists clenched tightly in her lap as the technician worked, swabbing the inside of her children's mouths and labeling everything with care. Jingyi stood nearby, his arms crossed as he watched silently, his gaze never leaving Ying's face. He could see the tension in her posture, the small ways she tried to keep her anxiety contained. When the technician briefly glanced her way, offering a practiced smile meant to reassure, her grip on the hem of her shirt tightened. In some cultures, the preservation of bloodlines is deeply entwined with family honor, even identity itself. Madame Beau's insistence on a paternity test was not simply a matter of curiosity, it was a declaration. For her, lineage wasn't just important, it was everything. If the children were not Jingyi's, the family's foundation, their carefully constructed image of perfection, would crumble. But for Su Ningying, this wasn't about reputation, it was about truth. She already knew where her strength lay, but now she had to endure the indignity of proving it to others. The days that followed crawled forward at an agonizing pace. Every hour felt heavier than the last, and every second ticked by like the loud toll of a bell. To Ningying, the waiting wasn't passive, it was actively suffocating. At night, she lay awake, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, as her mind circled back to every interaction she'd had in the Beau household. When she closed her eyes, she could still see the skeptical stares, the thinly veiled accusations that carried more venom than the outright insults she'd grown used to at work. The test results felt like a ticking clock, each second echoing louder in her heart. She had read that phrase somewhere before, some book or article she couldn't quite recall now. But in this moment, it felt like the words had been plucked directly from her chest. Every tick of the clock on her wall seemed to grow louder, its rhythmic beat almost deafening in the quiet of her apartment. She reminded herself of the facts, grounding herself in truths that no one else seemed to believe. The children were Jingyi. She knew this as surely as she knew her own name, and yet the weight of societal expectation still pressed down on her like a stone. This wasn't just about biology, it was about identity, theirs and hers. Societal stigma often intensifies when motherhood and autonomy intersect. For single mothers like Su Ningying, societal expectations become another layer of judgment, one that directly shapes the way others perceive her worth. The doubt cast upon her children's legitimacy wasn't just a question of paternity, it was a societal indictment of her as a person. And though she told herself often that she didn't care what others thought, the truth was more complicated. No one, no matter how stoic, is entirely immune to the wounds inflicted by skepticism and rejection. The day the results arrived, the air felt different. There was a charge to it, like the faint hum of electricity before a lightning storm. Su Ningying sat on one side of the long oak table in the Beau family dining room, her children seated quietly beside her. On the other side sat Madame Beau and the other assembled family members, all rigid and austere, as though bracing for impact. Jingyi stood between both groups, the unsaid bridge linking one to the other. The envelope was opened with agonizing slowness, every crinkle of paper sounding deafening in the otherwise still room. The words were read aloud, each one dropping into the silence like a stone in still water. The results confirm Beau Jingyi is the biological father. What followed wasn't relief. Not immediately. First, there was silence. A silence so taut, it felt as though the room itself might crack under its pressure. Then came the murmurs, soft and hesitant at first, but growing steadily louder. Madame Beau's rigid expression flickered for the briefest moment, a crack in her polished veneer, revealing something more human beneath. Some of the family members exchanged glances, their earlier skepticism now tempered with awkward, forced smile. They pretended the question of paternity had been a mere formality, but everyone in the room knew better. Jingyi let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He didn't look at them, didn't acknowledge their poorly masked relief. Instead, his focus remained on the only thing that mattered to him, Su Ning. She didn't say anything at first. Her fingers brushed against the table, tracing its grooves, as if grounding herself in its texture. She finally lifted her chin, meeting Madame Beau's gaze head-on. Madame Beau cleared her throat, standing as she smoothed the fabric of her gown. "Well," she said, her tone as composed as ever, though her hesitation gave away more than she intended. "It seems this matter has been resolved. I trust we can now move forward as a family." The statement felt like a concession more than a welcome. The words were there, yes, acceptance, acknowledgement, but they were hollow. Su Ningying could feel it in the way Madame Bo barely glanced at the children, in the way some family members lingered by the door, as though eager to leave. Acceptance, in this case, was an obligation driven by the results, not a genuine shift of the heart. But for Su Ningying, it was enough. She hadn't fought this battle for their approval. The results weren't for them. They were for her children. Their place in this family was now indisputable, no matter how reluctant anyone was to admit it. As the family began to disperse, the tension in the room now replaced with awkward small talk. Qingyi moved to stand beside her. He didn't speak at first, but his presence felt steadying. When their eyes met, he offered a small nod, a silent promise that this wasn't the end. It was just one more step on a path they would navigate together. The test may have settled one question, but it left others waiting to be answered. The family's acceptance was conditional, their approval thin as ice. For Su Ningying, the real battle was only beginning. Madame Bo chose her words carefully, as she always did, but the steel beneath them was impossible to miss. "Jingqie," she began, her voice calm but heavy with intention. "It's time you consider your duty to this family. You must know by now that certain opportunities require us to think beyond emotion. Stability, a legacy. These things matter." Bo Jianyi said nothing, but the stillness in his body signaled resistance. He waited for her to continue, knowing she would lay her real intentions bare soon enough. She placed a folder on the table between them. It was thin, but meticulously arranged, as though its mere presence demanded reverence. "The May family," she said evenly, her eyes scanning his face for any reaction. "They've been our allies in business for years. Their daughter is an exceptional match. She has the education, the poise, the connections to bring value to this family." There it was. The proposal wasn't subtle, nor did it pretend to be about anything but the family's need to preserve their standing. He resisted the urge to sigh, rubbing the bridge of his nose instead. "Mother," he said, keeping his tone steady, "we've discussed this. I've already made my decision." "Yes, and it's a decision that jeopardizes everything this family has worked for." Her words were sharper now, precise as a scalpel, each one designed to cut. "This, Su Ningying," she said, practically spitting the name, "has no place in our world. A single mother, an outsider. Do you have any idea what people will say?" That was the crux of it. To Madame Bo, this wasn't just about Jingyi's personal life. It was about the family's reputation, their carefully constructed image of perfection. The Bo family's wealth wasn't just money. It was influence, power, the kind of legacy that demanded unbroken appearances. And Su Ningying, in Madame Bo's eyes, was a crack in the facade, a risk too great to ignore. But Jingyi wasn't moved. "I'm not interested in maintaining appearances at the expense of my own happiness," he said simply, his voice firm but calm. "And as for Ningyi, she's stronger than you give her credit for." His words only seemed to fuel her frustration. She rose from her chair, pacing slowly across the room. "You seem to think this is only about you, but marriage is about more than love, Jingyi. It's about the family it builds, the legacy it creates. You are a Bo. That name carries responsibilities, obligations. You cannot simply ignore them for your own whims. The May family understands this. Why can't you?" The tension hung heavy in the air. Jingyi's jaw tightened as she spoke, and for a moment, he simply stared at the folder on the table without touching it. Finally, he lifted his gaze to meet hers. "And what happens," he asked quietly, "when the legacy you're so determined to protect starts to suffocate the people in it? What happens when it becomes more about power than family?" The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Madame Bo's lips pressed into a thin line, but for once, she had no immediate response. Jingyi didn't press further. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving her behind, with her perfectly arranged folder still unopened on the table. But Madame Beau wasn't done. If she couldn't persuade him with logic, she would find another way. As the weeks passed, Jingyi found himself entangled in one deliberate obstacle after another. Invitations to casual lunch meetings with women, hand-picked by his mother, started to arrive at his office. Business deals he'd been working on for months grew more complicated as new conditions cropped up, ones crafted to demand cooperation with families Madame Beau deemed valuable allies. Jingyi handled it all with careful precision, never once losing his composure, but the strain was undeniable. Some nights he returned to Ningyin's apartment noticeably quieter, his usual calm giving way to exhaustion. If she noticed, she didn't press him on it. Instead, she poured him tea, asked about his day, and shared stories about the children. It was her way of reminding him what they were fighting for. Even so, the pressure didn't stop at Madame Beau. The whispers grew louder, not just in his circles, but in hers. At work, Su Ningying noticed how her colleagues had become bolder in their disdain, emboldened by the rumors that spread like wildfire. "He won't marry her," they said when they thought she couldn't hear. "She's not his type. Someone like him would never risk it all for someone like her." It was as if the world conspired to keep them apart, testing the limits of their love and resolve. Every glance, every word carried the weight of expectation, and yet, even as the pressure mounted, they stood firm, weathering it all with a quiet determination that refused to be broken. This research shows that individuals who defy family expectations in relationships often face social ostracism and familial conflict. In high-power families like the Beaux, where marriage often serves as a strategic alliance, this defiance can feel like a threat to everything the family values. For Jingyi, choosing Su Ningning wasn't just an act of rebellion. It was a declaration of independence, a refusal to let his life be dictated by tradition and obligation. But independence has a cost, and Jingyi knew that better than anyone. The breaking point came one evening, during yet another family dinner. The tension had been simmering all night, building with every pointed comment and carefully veiled insult directed at Ning. Finally, Madame Beau leaned forward, her tone icy as she said, "Jingyi, this nonsense has gone on long enough. You have responsibilities to this family, to the business. How long do you intend to embarrass us by dragging this farce out?" Ning Yin's face flushed, but she stayed silent, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Jingyi's expression, however, darkened. He pushed back his chair and rose to his feet, his movements deliberate and purposeful. The room fell silent. "Enough," he said, his voice steady but filled with an authority that demanded attention. "I've listened to your concerns. I've let you disrespect someone I care about, but I will not allow this anymore. You talk about responsibilities. My responsibility is to the people I love. My responsibility is to Ningying and to my children, and if that means disappointing you, then so be it." The room remained frozen as he turned to Ningning, taking her hand and helping her to her feet. "This is the family I choose," he said simply, his voice softer now, but no less firm. "Not because I'm defying you, but because they are my happiness, and I won't sacrifice that for anyone, not even you." The finality in his words left nothing open for debate. Madame Beau's expression was unreadable, her carefully practiced mask slipping for the first time. She studied him for a long moment, and for a fleeting second, something like regret flickered across her features. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter. "You're your father's son," she said, not as a compliment, but as a resigned observation. "Stubborn, reckless, but sincere." She rose from her chair, smoothing her dress. "If this is your choice, Jingyi, it is yours to bear." She leveled her gaze at Ningying, her expression neither warm nor cruel. "I trust you'll make it worth the risk." It wasn't the blessing they had hoped for. It was tentative, reluctant, more an acknowledgement than approval. But for Ningning, it was enough. As they left the dining room hand in hand, she felt lighter than she had in months. The battle wasn't fully won, but for the first time, the path forward seemed a little clearer. the weight of the world just a little less heavy on her shoulders. With the family's acceptance, the future ahead seemed brighter, but one last test was still waiting for them. The Riverside Garden Design Competition was considered one of the most prestigious events in the architectural world. Designers competed for more than just prizes. A win here solidified reputations, opening doors to bigger projects and greater recognition. For Su Ningying, this competition wasn't just the promise of advancement, it was her moment of vindication. After enduring endless judgment, both at work and in her personal life, this was her chance to let her work speak for her in a way words never could. And yet, she walked into it knowing the odds were stacked against her. Her colleagues weren't subtle in their skepticism. Few even bothered to congratulate her when they learned she'd earned a spot in the finals. Some muttered comments within earshot, masking their cruelty behind feigned humor. What's she going to do? Design a daycare instead of a garden? Josie sneered one afternoon, her laugh echoed by the others gathered in the break room. Every glance Su Ningning endured carried some mix of doubt or outright disdain, and though she kept her face composed, each remark chipped away at something deeper. Workplace culture had been relentless for her, and this competition was no escape. Even before the designs were submitted, whispers of, "She doesn't belong here," dogged her steps. Where her colleagues saw her status as a single mother, as a blemish, she saw it as something else entirely. Her children were not a weight holding her back, but a source of strength. When others worked late nights, she worked longer. When deadlines loomed, she ignored the exhaustion that followed her home. Her resilience wasn't a choice, it was survival, something she had grown accustomed to carrying quietly. This competition, however, brought a new kind of pressure. The stakes were massive, and no one understood that better than Su Ningying. She knew the judges would scrutinize every element of her submission, and she couldn't risk falling into the narrative her peers had already written for her, that she wasn't good enough, that her approach would lack innovation. To deliver something extraordinary, she would have to dig deeper than she had before. The theme of the competition, designing for harmony, struck a chord with her immediately. Drawing from her own journey, she didn't see harmony as something inherent or easily achieved. It was something worked for, fought for, and shaped by pushing through hardship. Her design wouldn't be just a functional space. It would tell a story. Unlike the clean, static lines favored by others, hers was full of winding paths, represented life's unpredictable turns. Clusters of varying plants stood for diversity coexisting in the same ecosystem, thriving together. It was, in her way, a metaphor for what she had endured and what she aspired to create. Resilience through connection, beauty born from struggle. Her design was more than just lines on paper. It was a story of resilience, etched in every detail. But as she dove deeper into her vision, things didn't go smoothly. Throughout the preparation phase, setbacks seemed to chase her. Twice, her presentation files were corrupted, with hours' worth of work lost. Her tools disappeared from her designated workspace, clearly moved by someone familiar with her process. It wasn't difficult to guess who was behind it. Josie had already been made bitter by the recent exposure of her sabotage at work, and had every reason to undermine Ning. The office itself, brimming with rivalries and hidden alliances, wasn't free of pettiness. When Ningning caught glimpses of smug smiles as she scrambled to recover her files, the temptation to confront them burned hot in her chest. But she restrained herself, staying silent. Fighting with words wasn't a battle she wanted to wage anymore. Her response to sabotage would be pouring every ounce of her frustration into making the design everything it could be, and more. "There's no room for error now," she found herself whispering late one night, the clock ticking past midnight. Her children had fallen asleep hours ago, their soft breaths filling the small apartment while she worked at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and sketches. Her fingers twitched from holding pencils for too long, and her eyes stung from hours of focus. And yet, as tired as she was, giving up wasn't an option. She reminded herself that creativity wasn't just about skill. It was a culmination of persistence and emotion, a channeling of passion into something tangible. Researchers often highlight how creativity and perseverance go hand in hand when facing adversity, serving as tools not only for problem solving, but for asserting one's place in the world. For Ning Ying, her design became a form of self. By the time she stood on stage to present her project to the judges and audience, the weight she carried had turned into a quiet determination. This wasn't just about the competition anymore. It was about showing who she was, beyond the labels people had placed on her. As the lights dimmed and her projection lit up behind her, she took a deep breath, steadying herself. It wasn't fear she felt, but anticipation, the culmination of countless hours and sleepless nights, leading her to this moment. She spoke clearly, walking the judges through her design with confidence. She explained how the winding paths reflected her belief in embracing change, how the thousands of tiny plant lights integrated into the garden created a glow at night, signifying warmth and hope. Every detail she shared painted not just a picture of a physical place, but a story of progress and perseverance, fueled by creativity. The audience watched with rapt attention, captivated by how personal her concept felt. Even the judges, seasoned professionals known for their stoicism, leaned forward as she began highlighting small, meaningful touches within the design. By the end of her presentation, applause erupted around the room. She paused for half a second before allowing herself to take in the reaction, her heart pounding as the sheer relief coursed through her. When the competition finally concluded, the winners were called to the stage. Her name echoed through the hall, and for a fleeting moment, everything blurred. She remembered walking toward the podium, but the details of her steps vanished in a haze of sound and light. All she could feel was the immense weight lifting off her shoulders. She was handed a plaque, and as the judge described her work as transformative and deeply human, her vision glossed over with a rare warmth. This wasn't just a win on paper. It was a rejection of everything others had doubted in her. Back at the office, the reactions were predictably mixed. A wave of stunned silence at first, followed by an awkward congratulatory applause. Josie, clutching her coffee cup tightly, forced a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes, while others scrambled to acknowledge her talent as though they hadn't spent months dismissing her. Ningning accepted their congratulations with grace, but inside, she knew their approval no longer held meaning. What mattered now wasn't their acceptance, it was knowing she had proved herself on her terms. What the colleagues hadn't realized, and perhaps never would, was how deeply personal her triumph was. For them, it was just another competition win, a blip on the company's internal radar. For Su Ningning, it was a declaration that she could rise above their whispers and sabotage. It reminded them, and herself, that no amount of judgment could dim her capability. As the days followed her victory, Ningyi found herself receiving opportunities she had never been offered before. Clients, impressed by her work in the competition, requested her specifically for projects. What had once seemed so out of reach was now at her fingertips, a career shaped entirely by her own determination and talent. She hadn't needed someone to speak for her or open doors behind the scenes. She had built her own path, each step forged from the same resilience that had kept her going, even on nights when everything felt impossible. Her biggest supporter, of course, had been Bo Jingyi, though he watched her journey unfold from the sidelines. Every word of encouragement and every quiet gesture of support had offered her the steady reassurance she needed. He had known what she was capable of long before anyone else did, and now the world saw what he had always believed in. Her win wasn't just about earning a title or silencing the harshest critics. It was about finally reclaiming the dignity that so many had tried to take from her. From Josie's sneers to her colleagues' doubt, everything they had thrown her way was meant to break her, but she had turned it into fuel, layering all the pain and frustration into something meaningful. As she sat at her desk a week after the competition, freshly printed plans for a new project spread before her, the satisfaction didn't come from the recognition or the new assignments. It came from knowing she had been right to bet on herself when no one else had. She looked at the figures she'd drawn, the curving lines of her vision still fresh in her mind, and finally allowed herself to smile without hesitation. Her professional life had taken a dramatic turn, one that she was still adjusting to, but while that victory had given her much, she knew it wasn't the most important one. In the end, her journey wasn't just about buildings, projects, and titles. It was about what those things allowed her to create, a foundation not just for herself, but for the family she was building by her side. And though her story in the office seemed to press forward with unstoppable momentum, the most important moment was yet to come. The sunlight streamed into the small but thoughtfully decorated living room, casting a soft glow over the coffee table, where a vase of freshly picked wildflowers sat. Su Ningyin stood by the window, her gaze drifting out toward the park across the street, where her children laughed as they chased each other in wide circles. It was the kind of quiet moment she used to dream about, the kind she'd never dared to believe might be hers one day. Now, it was her reality. Behind her, the familiar creak of a chair shifting brought her back to the present. Bo Jingyi sat at the table nearby, poring over a set of hand-drawn blueprints she'd been revising earlier that morning. He wasn't looking at her, not yet, but there was an ease in his presence that made her aware of him all the same. Life didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. That realization came to Ning Ning gradually over the past few months, like the first signs of spring quietly breaking through winter's hold. For so long, she had been bracing herself for the next fight, the next storm. But now, surrounded by the people that mattered most to her, it was starting to feel like she could breathe again. It hadn't come easy, though. She leaned lightly against the windowsill, her fingers tracing patterns along the wood, as her thoughts drifted back to everything they had overcome to reach this point. The echoes of her past still lingered in her mind, though less sharply now. The cruel whispers in the office, the way her colleagues' disdain often carried louder than words. All of that had felt endless once. Facing the accusations that could have ruined her career, the disapproval of Jingyi's family that nearly broke her spirit, and even the doubts she quietly carried about herself. These challenges had threatened to take everything she'd worked for, and yet, piece by piece, they had rebuilt, together. Her voice broke the comfortable silence that had settled between them. He looked up, a faint smile tugging at his lips, in that way it always did when she called his name without preamble. Do you ever think about all of it? About how different things could have been if... She trailed off, uncertain of how to frame the question, without inviting the weight she no longer wanted to carry. He set the blueprints down carefully, as though even the smallest part of the moment deserved attention. If what? He asked softly. If we hadn't fought for this? There was no hesitation in his tone, no second guessing. I think about it, yes, he admitted, leaning back in his chair. Not because I regret where we've been, but because it reminds me of where we are now, and how much stronger we are for it. They both knew the truth of what he said, even without speaking it aloud. Their journey hadn't been about finding each other in the simplest sense. It had been about becoming the people they were meant to be, stronger, braver, and more deeply connected than either of them likely could have imagined. He had been her lifeline, in moments where she wasn't sure she could stand, just as she had been his anchor through the storms his family had brought. Speaks to the way shared adversity strengthens relationships, creating spaces of trust and empathy that grow deeper with every challenge faced. For Ningyi and Jingyi, moments of doubt, anger, and pain hadn't driven them apart. Those moments had shaped the foundation they now stood on. The children's voices drifted faintly through the open window, clear and full of joy, pulling Ningying from her thoughts. She smiled faintly, glancing back at where Jingyi was watching her now with quiet curiosity. It's just I never thought life could look like this, she admitted, brushing back a loose strand of hair. So peaceful, so full. It's not just life, he said, his eyes steady. This is what we built, Ningning, you and me. The simplicity of his words carried a weight that left her rooted to the spot. This wasn't the life they had stumbled into, or hoped might work itself out. Every step they had taken to get to this quiet moment had been intentional, a choice made over and over again, even when it seemed impossible. It was this mutual commitment that made their bond feel unshakable. Their shared experiences have reinforced their dedication to each other and their family. Those were ideas she'd come across before, abstract concepts she'd once studied in books or articles about relationships. But now, she lived those ideas more vividly than she ever could have imagined. After all they had faced, unforgiving colleagues, societal judgment, battles within Jinyi's family, this moment of stillness felt profound, earned. Later that evening, once the children had been bathed and tucked into bed, Ningning and Jingyi sat together on the small balcony of the apartment. The cool night air wrapped them in its quiet embrace, and the faint sounds of distant traffic hummed below. A soft light spilled out from the living room, warming the edges of their silhouettes as they leaned against the railing. Qingyi ran his fingers absently over the edge of the coffee cup in his hand. "I've been thinking," he started, his voice low but certain. Ningning glanced at him curiously. "About what?" "About what's next," he said simply. "For us, for the kids, for everything we're building together." She tilted her head slightly, the memory of their journey flashing briefly in her mind. The fights they had endured, even when they were quiet ones fought internally. The bridges they had built from nothing, when it seemed like there was no safe path forward. "And what do you see when you think about that?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. He looked at her then, and the weight of his gaze told her exactly how deeply he had considered this. "I see us moving forward," he said, "somewhere with more space for the kids, somewhere that feels like ours, and only ours. I see building something solid, a home." The simplicity of his words carried an unexpected power, and she swallowed the faint lump rising in her throat. It wasn't a grand declaration, but a quiet promise, a vow to protect the life they'd fought so hard to create. His words reflected more than immediate plans. They revealed the kind of future he wanted to build with her and their family. Their plans for the future didn't end there, either. Over the months, they talked often about the shape their lives might take, where they might live, how they would continue to navigate the lingering opinions of those who didn't understand their choices. But more than anything, their conversations focused on the core of it all, protecting the happiness they had found and the family they had become. "This commitment is a powerful predictor of relationship success," she remembered reading once, and it resonated now in a way it hadn't before. That kind of commitment, the quiet, steady kind, had become the bedrock of their lives. The challenges they had faced weren't erased by these new plans. The scars they carried from the battles they had fought didn't disappear, but they no longer defined them. Instead, they served as reminders of what they had overcome together. Every storm they had braved had become an opportunity for growth, a chance to deepen the connection that held them together when the world seemed intent on pulling them apart. Couples who view challenges as opportunities for growth are more likely to maintain a strong and resilient relationship. That sentiment rang in her mind, but it wasn't just words anymore. It was a truth she lived every day. She saw it in the way Jingyi reached for her hand without hesitation, even in moments of tension. She saw it in the quiet smiles that passed between them when words weren't necessary, in the trust that sat unshaken beneath the surface of even their hardest days. As the evening stretched on toward midnight, the two of them lingered outside a little longer, letting the cool breeze pass over them. Bo Jingyi turned his head to glance at Ning Ying and gave her a faint, knowing smile. Her chest filled with warmth as the realization settled over her. This was their life now. No grand gestures, no dramatic system. Their story wasn't just one of perseverance or love triumphing over adversity. It was about transformation. The journey they shared had pushed them to become the versions of themselves they were always meant to be. Stronger, more compassionate, more resilient. And as she leaned into his shoulder, the hum of the city below carried into the night. She thought about what their story might look like to others. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But as she looked out past the balcony and into the endless expanse of stars, one thought settled over her like a soft, sure whisper. They had built something beautiful, something that couldn't be undone. Their story was a testament to the power of love, resilience, and the courage to defy expectations. They were proof that even against the harshest odds, a family united by love could triumph over everything else. In the end, it wasn't power or wealth that defined their story. It was the strength of their hearts. Su Ning Ying, underestimated and scorned, proved that resilience could silence prejudice. Her unwavering love for her children and refusal to compromise stood as a testament to her values. Bo Jingyi, despite concealing his identity, embraced his role not out of duty, but out of love, forging a family bonded by trust. What challenges would you face to protect what truly matters? Their journey reminds us that sincerity, love, and perseverance can change not just lives, but hearts as well.